Hello and welcome back to JBCTR and my KIF. So today we are adding a little bit of wideness to the Fiesta ST. Okay, so what is it that we're installing today? So today I'm putting on some H&R hub-centric spacers. These are 20mm at each corner, which means total axle widening will be around about 40mm, so pretty noticeable. I have driven a car with these on already. It drives wonderfully and the stance is much better than it is a stock. The issue I'm finding now is that because I've lowered the car down, especially the top of the wheels seem to be really far into the arches. And I think it looks a bit strange. So yeah, that's why these are here, and let's get into fitting. Okay, so before you start fitting, you want to double check that everything that you need is in the box. So you'll get a selection of instructions which will help you fit them, but you've got this fitting guide, so you may or may not need them. You'll need a total of 8 bolts for the Fiesta ST. You'll need 10 if you've got a 5-stud pattern, but for this car it's 8, and that is to hold the spacers onto the wheel, and then obviously you can use your OEM nuts and locking wheel nut to hold the wheel onto your spacer. And then of course you need 2 spacers in each packet, so if you want to do all 4 corners like I'm doing, you'll need to order 2 sets. So that is the spacer. So I'm sure you've probably seen these before. If you haven't, this is it, and this center bit here is the difference between an expensive and a decent spacer and a cheap one. So this essentially aligns the spacer with the center of the wheel, and means your wheel's not going to slide around if the bolts get even slightly loose. So that is why this is a decent spacer, and as you can see, it's fairly self-explanatory. Standard bolts go through here, and then that needs to be flush, and then your alloy goes onto the new supplied bolts. So looks like we've got everything. Let's get on with it. Oh, before I forget, the tools you'll need are a 19mm socket set. As you can see, I bought this one especially for my alloys. It's got a plastic coating, which means if you're a bit cack-handed like I am, you won't damage your alloys, which is quite nice. I also choose to use a breaker bar just because it makes life easier. So you need that for removing the wheels, and then when it comes to doing them up, you'll also need one of these. So this is a torque wrench. I won't tell you which torques you need to use because I don't want that responsibility, but they are freely available on the internet. So yeah, invest just in one of these. They're not so expensive, and it's worthwhile knowing exactly how tight your nuts are done up. And last, and by no means least, is one of these, because if you haven't got a jack, then it's going to be pretty difficult to get your wheels off. I would also recommend using axle stands if you have them. Unfortunately, I've left mine at my parents', which is slightly annoying. But as we're not actually crawling underneath the car, I'm happy to rely on the jack, as I happen to think that my Arkan jack is quite a good one. So let's make a start on the rears, as they're easiest, and let's go on with it. Oh. Okay, so before we start jacking, best place to start is in the car. So firstly, you want to make sure that you are in gear. You can either do first or second, or even reverse. Some people like reverse, but any gear is better than no gear, as that will stop the front wheels from turning unnecessarily. And as we're doing the front and rear, you also want to lock the back wheels, so just make sure your handbrake is nice and tight. And the other recommendation I would make as a precaution is to chock the wheels at the opposite end of the car that you're not lifting. So at the moment we're lifting the back, which means I need to chock the front wheels just to ensure that there is no movement in the car. You can use anything you like, bricks, whatever. I've got a bit of leftover wood, perhaps a bit long, but it's what I could find. So yeah, let's get them under the wheels. Just kick them under like that. And now we should be ready to jack. Okay, so that is the wheel off. As you can see, it's fairly, or pretty much as you'd expect. If you're interested in my discs, a little bit rusty because I washed it yesterday, but I've done an install video on how to install these upgraded discs, and I think they look quite cool, to be honest. But anyway, slight tangent. As you can see, we've got this sort of centre lock thing here, which is then mimicked on the H&R spaces here. Now, before we install these over here, H&R recommend that you wire brush this middle bit here. I'm not going to do that today, mainly because I only had the brakes fitted last week and we did it as part of that installation. So generally speaking, I would always wire brush this little centre bit here, just get rid of all rust and make sure there's nothing left on it. But for us today, it's a simple case of slide on, sit nice and flush. There we go. Now, the first thing that I've noticed, having put these on loosely, is I was hoping the bolts would be flush. As you can see, they're not, unfortunately. However, if you go on to and have a look at the wheel, you can see that on the back here, oh God, don't let me drop it. On the back here, there are these quite big indents into the wheel in, well, pretty much the places where the studs are going to go. So I have a feeling we might be able to get away with this one, but let's have a bit of a test fit. So to do the test fit, I'm just going to put a couple of the slimmer H&R bolts on here just to hold the spacer in place. I'll spin these up quickly. And one point that's probably worth noting is my fan-dangled protect your rims thing unfortunately doesn't fit into the spacer holes. So a normal socket is required for these. Right, okay, so these are not tight, but they're on enough to stop the spacer from moving around too much. And I've now got a little bit of chalk, so I'm going to just chalk up the end as much as I can of these little nubbins here. And then we'll put the wheel on, and hopefully we'll see no chalk transfer onto the wheel, which means these are clearing. So let's give it a try. And fortunately, there is no chalk transfer on there at all. The chalk on the end of these tips is still intact, so that means we don't have to cut them down. Yes! And now it's just a case of putting the wheel on for the final time, doing up the nuts, and that's your first spacer fitted. And as I said when taking the wheel off, I recommend you just put the nuts on as tight as they need to be, really, just hold the wheel on. Lower the car down so the wheel touches the floor, but not any weight on the wheel, and then do the nuts up. Just removes a bit of pressure on your jack. So here we go. So there we go, that is your first spacer fitted. Just to lower the car down a bit more. There we go, so that's fully on the weight. And if you want to do one final sanity check that they're sitting right, just double check the gap between the spacer and the wheel is even and not massive all the way around, and mine seems to be sitting flush, so that's good news. Just another 3 to go.
So spit it out to my face, it's okay. I've been busy working late, unrehearsed in my face, like repeating my mistakes. It's alright, it's okay, there is no one else to blame. So spit it out to my face, it's okay. I've been busy working late, unrehearsed in my face, like repeating my mistakes. It's alright, it's okay, there is no one else to blame.
So that is the rears done. Now we move on to the fronts, and obviously important thing to mention is to remember to move your blocks to the back, just to stop it from rolling. So that is the spacer fitted, as you can see, and as with the rears, the nuts are protruding a little further than I would like. So as this is obviously on the front and not on the back, I'll do another little chalk test. So it's just a case of rub it on the end. Let's go get the wheel. Now, unfortunately, we have the teeniest of rubbings on the front. You can just see in here, so we're going to have to take a little bit of a file to these, unfortunately. So let's get on with it. So I can now see that there's no chalk on the wheel, and there is chalk on there. So yeah, bit of a result. Now, as I've torqued up the bolts already, it's just a case of slapping the wheel on now, which is pretty nice. But the one thing I would say from my experience of shortening down those studs is it was literally catching by millimeters, and that's why I chose to use a hand file. Now, doing it by hand gives you a nicer finish, and it also allows you to control just how much you take off, because I really didn't want to take off any more than I needed to. The only thing I would say, and in hindsight, and exactly what I'm going to do on the other side, is that I would recommend removing the spacers first. So despite it being a little bit more of a pain to test if they actually fit, I would recommend that you remove them before filing down, because I put a couple of nicks in mine. Not that it really matters, but not ideal. Right then, so we're on to the final side now, and thankfully I'm in the shade, so if I do have to do any filing, hopefully it won't be too hot this time. So there we have it. The chalk test reveals that these need to be ground down as well, and as a result I'll probably check the offside corner as well, just to be doubly safe. And as I mentioned, this time I'm going to take off the spacers before I start filing down. What do we reckon? Do you reckon this is enough? Let's have a look. Push it on nice and tight, give it a bit of a wiggle, take it off. Clean as a whistle. Result.
I want you right here, but you're all across the globe. Never call me back, even though you're on your phone. Wishful thinking it's the best of me, hoping that it's still you and me. Yeah, I thought we'd always shine. Just some time off, we'd be fine. Guess that I was wrong this time. When I think about it now, I know that I don't.
So there you have it. That's how you fit a set of wheel spacers to a MK8 Fiesta ST. Now, if I'm honest, at the top I think they fit absolutely perfectly, but if you look at the rears, they stick out just a bit too much for my liking. But I do have something to cover that a little bit later. We'll discuss that in the next video. But yeah, I hope you found this useful, and the last thing I would recommend anyone doing is just go for a quick drive, then come back and then just recheck all your wheel nuts just to make sure everything is still tight. So yeah, that was today's job, and it's been a good one. So if you enjoyed this, give it a thumbs up. If you want to see more of me and my Fiesta, then feel free to subscribe, and I will catch you in the next one.
There goes a sight from my soul.